The first thing Eliza Crow understood when the town began to call the silo a miracle was that miracles make men hungry in a way bread never can. And in the days that followed the storm, she watched gratitude rot into entitlement with the same slow certainty she had once watched her childhood home turn cold, because people came first with thanks and then with plans. And then with demands spoken softly enough to pretend they were not demands at all. And the silo that had been her refuge became a thing discussed in doorways and measured with eyes that did not ask permission, and she felt the old fear rise again. Not sharp like panic, but heavy, like the knowledge that history often repeats itself when no one is brave enough to stop it. They wanted her to stay there, they said, to keep the silo open for the town, to be its keeper, its symbol, its proof that God had not forgotten them. And Eliza listened, with her hands folded tight, remembering nights alone with the wind screaming through the cracks, remembering hunger that curled her spine in silence, that pressed against her ears until she thought she might disappear into it. And she wondered how easy it was for them to love the shelter without ever loving the girl who had built it out of nothing but will. There were voices that rose louder than the others, men who spoke of ownership and protection in the same breath, who suggested the silo should belong to the town council now forming itself out of fear and ambition. And she saw in their faces the same certainty she had seen the night she was turned out, the certainty that her usefulness had an expiration date, and that once it passed, she would be expected to step aside quietly. But there were others too, fewer, quieter, women who brought her food without asking, children who climbed the ladder and sat beside her listening to stories she made up just to hear them laugh, and an older man named Thomas Hale, whose back was bent from years of labor and whose eyes carried the weight of regrets he no longer tried to outrun. And he spoke to her one evening as the sun bled out across the plains, telling her that towns survive not because of land or buildings, but because someone decides to stand when it would be easier to leave. And Eliza felt something shift inside her, a realization that destiny was not a road laid out ahead of her, but a thing shaped moment by the choices she was afraid to make. When the drought worsened and the well finally ran dry, it was the silo that held the last of the grain, and with it the last fragile chance for the town to endure. And the arguments grew louder, knives appearing on belts where there had once been only tools, and Eliza lay awake at night listening to the murmur of voices below, wondering if survival always demanded a price paid in blood or betrayal, and whether she was strong enough to refuse both. The breaking point came on a night when the sky was clear and cruelly beautiful, stars sharp enough to cut, when a group of men came to the silo with torches not raised in threat but in ceremony, telling her it was time to make things official, time to sign away what she had built in the name of order and safety. And Eliza stood in the doorway with the wind tugging at her dress and the weight of every mile she had walked at 18 pressing down on her shoulders, and she understood then that if she gave in, she would survive, but she would never be free. And if she refused, she might lose everything, but she would keep her soul. And the choice burned through her fear until it became clarity. She told them no, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her. And the silence that followed was thick and dangerous. And for a moment she thought it would end there, that the story would turn dark in the way so many stories of the frontier did. But then Thomas Hale stepped forward, and then another, people who had found shelter in the silo, and something like dignity in the way she had opened it, without asking for anything in return. And the men with torches lowered their eyes, because power, she learned, often dissolves when faced with unity it did not expect. The days that followed were harder than anything she had known before, because leadership without authority is a lonely thing, and Eliza worked until her hands split and her body ached, rationing grain, organizing watches, teaching others how to mend and build and share the burden she had carried alone for so long. And in the process, she felt the silo change again, no longer just a refuge, but a promise made real, a place where survival did not have to mean cruelty. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the town changed too. When the rains finally came, soft at first and then steady enough to soak the land until it sighed with relief, people stood in the open and let themselves be drenched, laughing and crying as if reborn. And Eliza watched from the ladder, rain washing the dust from her skin, knowing that the girl who had been kicked out at 18 had not only survived, but had built something that would outlast her fear. She never left the silo, though she could have, and she never claimed ownership in the way men understood it. But years later, when travelers came through and asked how the town had endured when so many others vanished into history, people would point to the tall, weathered structure at its heart and tell the story of a young woman who had nowhere to go and chose to stand anyway. And Eliza Crow would listen from the shadows, a faint smile touching her lips, understanding at last that destiny had not been something done to her, but something she had answered. And as the wind moved through the plains and the silo held fast against time, her story became a reminder, carried forward like a quiet vow, that even in the harshest places, one person's courage can become shelter for many. And if this story stirred something in you, if you believe stories like this deserve to live on, then stay with the Western Tales, subscribe, and keep the fire of these untold frontiers burning, because as long as someone listens, the West is never truly gone, their breaths loud in the heat. And when they stepped into the cave and saw the green, saw the tall stalks and full ears forming, saw life where they had expected madness, silence fell heavy as prayer, and Lila watched their faces change, watched awe give way to calculation, watched the old hunger light kindle behind their eyes, and she felt a cold settle in her chest, because miracles make men hungry in a way bread never can. And she remembered that truth too late to take it back, and soon the whole town knew. And soon they came in numbers, first with thanks, then with plans, then with demands spoken softly enough to pretend they were not demands at all, asking how much, asking when, asking why she should have so much when everyone else had so little. And Lila answered carefully, setting rules, saying the corn would be shared, that the harvest must be done right, that the cave could not be trampled, that greed would ruin what patience had built. And for a time it worked. Baskets. Filled bellies eased, and the mocking stopped, replaced by a wary respect that felt like a blade laid flat across her palm. And at night she lay awake listening to the wind and the distant murmur of voices, wondering how long gratitude would last before it curdled, because she had seen that arc before, had felt it in her bones the night her husband died, and the neighbors came with casseroles, and then with questions about land and water and what she would do now that she was alone. And as the corn ripened and the air cooled just a touch, a council formed without her. Men meeting in back rooms, women whispering at the well, and rumors reached her on the wind, talk of ownership, of rights, of taking what was needed for the common good. And Lila stood in the cave one evening, hands brushing the heavy ears, and felt fear coil slow and deliberate in her gut, because she knew the cave could not feed everyone forever, knew that even abundance had limits, and that when those limits came into view, choices would have to be made, choices that would reveal what kind of people they truly were. And as she turned to leave, she heard footsteps where there should have been none, heard the scrape of boots on stone, and a voice spoke her name from the shadows, not mocking, not kind, but measuring, and the cave seemed to hold its breath as she faced the sound, knowing that whatever came next would decide not just the fate of her harvest, but the shape of the town itself. The man who stepped from the shadows of the cave was Sheriff Caleb Rourke, his badge dulled by dust and hard years, his eyes sharp with a kind of concern that had learned to disguise itself as authority. And in that moment, Lila understood that the struggle ahead would not be fought with drought or soil, but with people, which was always the harder war, because Rourke spoke calmly, telling her the town council meant no harm, that they only wanted to ensure fair distribution, that desperate times required. Strong hands. And as his words echoed against the stone, she felt the weight of every season she had survived alone, every bucket carried, every seed pressed into darkness with faith as the only guarantee. And she told him no, told him the cave would not be seized, that the corn would be shared as long as it was respected. And the sheriff's jaw tightened just enough to reveal the truth beneath his even tone, because respect was not what hunger wanted. And when he left, she knew it was only a matter of time before gratitude finished its slow rot into entitlement, and the days that followed proved her right, with more people arriving than the cave could safely hold, boots crushing young shoots, hands grabbing at ears before they were ready, voices rising in argument, and Lila standing between stalks like a scarecrow made of bone and will, pleading, reasoning, warning that ruin would follow greed. But warnings sound like insults to those who believe survival excuses everything. And one night, as a red moon climbed over the ridge, the council came with wagons and lanterns and a paper declaring the harvest property of the town. And Lila felt something break quiet and final inside her, because she saw then that if she yielded, the cave would be stripped bare in days and the miracle would die screaming. And so she did the only thing left to her. She burned her own bridge, setting fire to the outer dry brush she had stacked weeks before as insurance, flames leaping fast, and hungry, forcing the crowd back, smoke choking the cave mouth as she dragged baskets of corn deeper inside, sealing passages she had mapped in secret. And when the fire died, the cave was changed, narrowed, hidden again, and the town stood outside furious and afraid, calling her selfish, calling her a witch, calling for the sheriff to act. But Rourke hesitated, because in the light of the flames he had seen not madness but resolve. And over the weeks that followed, as the drought tightened its fist, Lila emerged only at dawn, leaving measured portions in the square, just enough to keep people alive, never enough to make them comfortable, teaching them patience the hard way. And something unexpected happened. Tempers cooled, work returned, men guarded the spring instead of fighting over it. Women rationed without complaint. Children learned that survival was a shared discipline, not a prize to be stolen. And when the rains finally came, soft and uncertain at first, then steady, the town endured, not because of the corn alone, but because Lila had forced them to remember what community actually cost. And when Green returned to the plains and the crisis loosened its grip, she did not stay to receive thanks or forgiveness, packing what little she owned and leaving before dawn, because her work there was finished and the cave belonged to the mountain again. But her story did not leave with her. It settled into the town like a scar and a lesson, told to children when crops were planted, told to newcomers who laughed too easily. And if this story moved you, if you felt the weight of survival, sacrifice, and quiet courage in the harsh breath of the Wild West, then remember that stories like this live on through those who listen and those who share. So subscribe to the Western Tales and keep these voices alive, because the past still has something to teach us if we're willing to hear it.